I we're going to have a chat about the situation at on board Pleanála. If you live in a house, or if you want to own a house, this should be of great interest to you.
Thanks very much, Morgan. So I'll just talk a little bit about the quite complex factual background, and I'll start with Paul Hyde and who he is. He's the deputy chairman of on board Pleanála at the moment. But his background is as an architect from Cork, and he also has a master's in planning. He ran a thing called the Hyde Partnership, which is apparently a multidisciplinary design and planning practice. He was a yachting friend of Simon Coveney, the current Minister for Foreign Affairs, some years ago, and I think they owned a yacht together. Co-owned a yacht. Yeah. And I think both of his parents were in Fine Gael, and he donations, I think his father gave donations to Fine Gael. But anyway, he was appointed by Phil Hogan to board Pleanála in 2014, and then promoted by another Fine Gael Minister, Owen Murphy, to deputy chairman a few years ago, increasing his salary from €110,000 to €140,000. His speciality in the board is that he's in charge of the strategic housing developments, which are a contentious stopgap whereby local authorities are bypassed and applications for big residential developments and student housing go directly to on board Pleanála. And they've been very controversial. They're typically on a large scale.
Misery farms.
Perhaps. And so a lot of them were challenged. Most of them were challenged or a lot of them were challenged in the High Courts, and 85% of those judicial reviews in the High Courts succeeded, very embarrassingly for Bord Pleanála, and not too excitingly from the point of view of Mr. Hyde himself being in charge of them. He's perceived to be one of the more pro-development members of the board. But that's small stuff really by comparison with the allegation that Ditch have made in a series of stories recently, which are about ethics and perhaps again law breaking in some of the things that he's done. So I suppose from my point of view, I was chairman of Ansbacher for years, and I'm immersed in the whole planning sphere, and Bord Pleanála over the last few years has been about as bad as it has been for any time over the last 30 years. It's a big important background of Bord Pleanála that it was set up in 1976 because there was a sense that the minister, when he had charge of planning appeals from local authorities, wasn't doing a very good job, and that it was a little bit dodgy. So Bord Pleanála was put in place to be an incarnation of probity in planning. Then a few years later, when there were a few problems, after Ray Burke tried to pack the thing with his acolytes, they introduced a very stringent system of panels and interviews for members of the board, particularly the chairperson. I was actually on one of those interview panels, so I've seen that the whole thing it's imbued with a stringent propriety, and it has largely avoided any scandal over the decades. And so this is big news for Bord Pleanála, which is such a crucial place in politics and in particular in planning, against a background of the planning tribunals, which of course found that there was endemic planning corruption throughout the system some years ago. So the problem from my point of view, Mr. Hyde doesn't really seem to have appreciated that at a salary of 140,000, it's not really, I think, in the spirit of membership of the board, that you would continue property development on the large scale that he seems to have been involved with. But there's no real need to go into too much of the details of what he was involved. But he's clearly involved with a vast range of developments. But in particular, he has latterly failed to declare those developments on the Bord Pleanála register, which is very important, that if you do have properties, that you declare them to the board. And failing to do so, unfortunately, from his point of view, is a crime. And he's also been involved in conflicts of interest where he has voted on schemes in which his relations have been involved. And also, not alone are you supposed to distance yourself and not be involved in the recuse yourself, but you're certainly not supposed to be voting on those decisions. And again, if you do that, that's a crime. Most tantalisingly, there's those are crimes under the Planning Act. I think it's section 147 and 148, those two. But there's from his point of view, perhaps the most dangerous issue is that if you're a member of the board and you engage in what's described as a composition or an arrangement, which is essentially if your financial affairs are compromised because you have to offer somebody less than you owe them because you can't afford to pay them. And he seems to have been involved in multiple receiverships and court cases that were settled and so on that seem to fit the bill. If you do that, you are self-vacating. You're no longer a member of the board. And so Village in an article and in a complaint that I lodged to Board Pleanála Direct and copied to the Minister, has made the case that he hasn't been a member of the board since he engaged in the first of those compositions or arrangements, which obviously poses problems for all of the decisions that he's been involved with, and maybe some of the SHD things that he's presided over, because he hasn't been a member of the board for some time.
How many decisions would have to be appealed?
That's a very good question. I mean, the
8 years of potential conflicts.
Yeah, potentially up to that.
In terms of bricks and mortar, that's tons and tons.
Today there was an announcement that there's a legal action being taken against the Board Pleanála on the basis of a decision made.
And I've been inundated with people claiming
which is
that
significant in I think it's going to be in the High Court. I could be wrong. I think Michael's been quite diplomatic, as he has to be, and we all have to be very careful to follow the lead that people are innocent until they're found guilty of something, of course. But there's certainly significant questions to be answered by Mr. Hyde about his behaviours. And the ditch investigation, which I was party to, I didn't lead it or anything of that nature, but it's been incredibly deep and forensic almost in its analysis of the decisions of the board,
and extraordinarily wide-ranging. The stories are just
extraordinarily wide-ranging. And so it's his failure to recuse himself from decisions which he had obvious material or familiar associations with. So the operation of the board, which is meant to be an oversight for due diligence and good practice, has become now the focus of a ministerially appointed senior counsel looking. So this is the beginning, in my view, of a significant issue for Board Pleanála, and the whole idea that an apparatus of the state, which was formed, as Michael very eloquently put, to police these decisions, which were riven with corruption essentially prior. I mean, back in the prior to its inception, there must have been rampant inappropriate.
Well, it was like the minister's grant, it was the favour.
Yeah. So I mean, the fact that this institution, which I think is respected and was respected, I think personally, I mean, there are some institutions of the state which you think they make the right decision, and this has really opened.
And how do you think it seems that Board Pleanála has dealt with the scandal since it arose?
The problem is when you have serial dysfunction in the apparatus of the state, you do get plenty of opportunities to move from one catastrophe to the next, and people become immune to it. We don't see it anymore.
Drunk, you get or corrupt.
Yeah. You're grand.
Tired of it. Yeah, it is that thing.
Yeah, but there's a huge amount of the impact that on Board Pleanála, similar to our health system. Health and justice are probably the only two things in Ireland that will impact everybody. Everyone will interact with the health system. Everybody will, or their family will. Inevitably, you will all die. We'll all end up in hospital at some stage, God forbid, and so will our families. Also, on Board Pleanála has a huge impact on the ability of citizens to build homes, to access homes,
which is famously not being done competently.
And the fact that we've exposed potential serious maladministration of that system, and we've done it. The Irish Times didn't do it. I mean, the Irish Independent didn't do it. I mean, the Irish Independent is run by €1 billion organisation. They didn't do an investigation.
Is that possible?
Why is this small brand new investigative platform doing this type of work? Why is Michael doing this type of work?
I'm going to cynically suggest it's because neither of your publications have a weekly property supplement.
Potentially, yeah. Or you really don't want to. Look, I've seen the evidence firsthand, and I can say this without fear of any sort of issue with it. I've seen the WhatsApp groups that the political parties operate to the journalists. I mean, they basically spoon feed. We refused. The one thing we decided in a ditch when we established it was we weren't going to even read press releases from political parties. We weren't even going to read them.
Good policy.
We were going to go and find out what was happening, and it takes immense amount, a huge sort of amount of forensic and boring, repetitive work to find it. But it's there. The fact that we can do that. Yeah. Why hasn't the mainstream media been doing its job here in this country? And I would suggest the reason is very simply because the mainstream media is predicated on that dysfunction, just like the private health system is predicated on the failure of the public system. So it's a circular dysfunction which is very well funded, and I think you don't shit where you eat. And the mainstream media eats in Leinster House. It gets its leaks, it gets its spoon-fed journalism from these same sources, and if you shit where you eat, you'll be cut off because there's always someone behind you. If the Times doesn't get it, the Examiner will, the Indo will, etc. So it's narration. The Independent and the Times have become narrators of Irish society. When it's safe enough to step up and the bullets stop flying, Kiev was full of journalists. There was only one or two there when the bullets were flying. Yeah. So the Indo and the Times will emerge when the air is cleared to start narrating what we've already seen. So that is not journalism, that's reporting. They just report on what's safe to report on. They don't actually go after the stories.
What it is. I mean,
what Ditch and Village are doing is journalism. Yeah. It's dangerous.
How would you define journalism?
Well, journalism is finding the truth and presenting it to the citizens to decide on how they're going to vote, and hope that has some impact on positive societal change.
I like that Pilger thing as well, tell somebody the weather. Somebody says it's sunny, somebody says it's rainy. It's not your job to say both. It's your job as a journalist to look at the fucking window.
I think so. I think you have to take sides in journalism. So we decided we were going to focus on the most mundane crookedness from a county council to the most impactful crookedness potentially in state bodies which curate the most important parts of our lives as citizens. We fund this state. We pay our taxes. We live here. We suffer the catastrophic consequences of political ineptitude. Yeah. So we need to pursue that and demand accountability.
I think also
what are my politics? My politics are irrelevant in this country. We've seen that with that Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, these two sworn enemies that said they dined in each other's blood before they'd coalesce. When Sinn Féin came up, who said we're actually going to change some things, suddenly they're best of pals.
They discovered all along they were the Tory.
And I mean this in the fullest sense. They may die in the ditch.
Yeah, possibly.
But I think that there's a general perception that the agenda of Bord Pleanála is esoteric, but of course planning determines so much of our lives. It determines quality of life. It's, like I have a big bugbear. I don't think the facilities that are available, the public facilities, the amount of parks, the amount of playgrounds are what they should be in this country, and that's because of bad planning. We live in a place where there's very little to do at weekends because we haven't planned for good things for people to do, as well as of course the pent up the problem.
Well, one thing COVID did was show us that
and affordable housing.
We can stand outside on the street and we can have a drink and we can talk and we can reconnect with each other. When we couldn't go into the pubs, there was a particular pub in Dublin where we used to sort of what's the word? We were like moths around the flame in the garden of that pub, it became a great place. It was great discussions.
Is that not called alcoholism?
Well, no. I mean, it was aided by alcoholism, but I think the fact that we realised that you can, we Irish can actually be outside even in bad weather. Yeah. If you sort of, I think they're going to pedestrianise Cable Street now. I think it's a pretty brave idea, but those things, the crisis gives the opportunity to think differently. And I think right now what we have to do is look at why do we tend to look the other way? Why do we feel that that's a given, whereas in France they would be.
Well, there isn't an adequately honed sense of the public interest.
Holding people to account. There's always that thing when the Irish default is, you know, when goes down and you feel lousy, blame it on the Brits. And, you know, because they were in charge for so long, and we have a political class or a political system that is great at pointing fingers away from themselves. And you know, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil used to be great at pointing at each other.
Yeah.
And actually, on the planning thing, on Board Pleanála, I remember when I was first interested in property, years ago I was a property journalist for a while and a photographer. And at the time, it would have been very much Fianna Fáil. You had that run of unbroken Fianna Fáil governments, and the moaning from the Fine Gael side was, but you know, I mean, they're fixing it for their mates. And are we not in a situation now? I mean, you talk about how mobbed up is a very emotive phrase, but I mean, how much Fine Gael?
Well,
is
I
in
think
the
that's a very, very important thing, that it was always perceived that Fianna Fáil were worse on probity issues than Fine Gael, but they took a rap on the knuckles, particularly after the tribunals, and I think they have made an effort to reform some of the types that were around the place when I was hanging around in county councils 30 years. They're no longer around, and Fine Gael seems to be the party that has the problem. But for the moment, you'd have to give credit to Darragh O'Brien and his reformed Fianna Fáil for at least having
even though this review that he's set up has no statutory power whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's inane. It has no power. Yeah. So it will inform what it wants him to inform, and it will be what he doesn't want to inform will be neglected. So the real issue here is if there has been criminal malfeasance in any state board or apparatus, should the Gardaí be informed and should they launch an investigation? Because we've seen very clearly from the Leo Varadkar saga that there's two things that bother Irish politicians: it's the revenue commissioners and the Garda Síochána. Everything else means fuck all to them because they can duck out of everything else, and there's two apparatus of the state that may be capable of delivering sort of a fatal blow to a political career seem to be on Garda Síochána and the revenue commissioners. So my view is that,
and tribunals to some extent.
Yeah, well, yeah, to some extent.
That thing, you know, you'd be judged by God long before you'd be judged by a tribunal.
Or the guards in some cases.
So in reality, I think something that was really innovative about what we did was to make that criminal complaint against Varadkar, which would form the basis for the investigation.
And was unorthodox.
It was unorthodox. We thought long and hard about doing it as well, but thankfully with your legal background, we had some sort of in-house, and we had some opinion from very bright lawyers as well who helped us out. So I think there's a naivety from the public that we believe that an investigation by Remy Farrell, who's paid by the minister, to suggest that Remy Farrell will deliver anything that's going to irk the minister, that's going to see the public light of day, is incredibly naive.
We're going to wrap up here, but just finally, has the ditch got more to publish on Board Pleanála?
Yeah, I think there's some more. Yeah, I think now that it's in a sort of a stage where it's pre-illegal as well, and I think with some legal threats against you, of course, which is endemic in Irish media as well. You know, we try to bully and scare everyone off from telling the truth, but it doesn't really work with us, so we're going to keep doing it. So there is more, so we're going to sit tight and have a look at what emanates from the inquiry, probably, I'd imagine. But there are other stories. There are plenty of other places to go. Ireland is like a fossil-rich beach, and you're a kid with a hammer. You know, it's
Yeah.
So there's plenty to look at. You know, who would have believed that, you know, you would find such dysfunction, you know, in one of the in a state institution which is essentially beyond reproach, because we expected that of them. You know, we didn't think we'd find anything, but we did. So that only, you know, whets the appetite, I suppose.
Okay, thank you very much.